Chapter 5. The Ritual of the Heads. 1987 was an expansive year for Crumpsellians, a whole tribe of weed-smoking, truth-seeking kids who were investigating altered states of consciousness in one way or another, had left their own suburbs, where council estate mentality reigned, to migrate southwesterly to the slightly safer, chilled-out sanctuary of Crumpsell. A large portion of the small village in which I had spent the majority of my childhood exists on archaic tracks, which could be one of the reasons why it has always attracted interesting, odd, eccentric, and in general, fundamentally uncommon folk. In the 80s, the surrounding areas of Moston, Harperhay and Blakely were occupied by scallies, as we called them, who didn't appreciate or accommodate for the likes of hippies or weirdos. There was an ample supply of scallies in Crumpsell, but the noticeable amount of strange folk who had always been there, partly consisting of patients who had congregated in the area from nearby institutions like Prestwich and the local psyche ward in Crumpsell, meant that there was pretty much an even balance. Most of the time, there wasn't too much tension between the tribes. 2 pubs in the village were the main haunts for the locals, and only one of them attracted the dropouts, which included us. The Edgerton Inn, or the Edge, as we called it, was by far the most diverse, being that it's situated on the border of Cheetham Hill and Crumpsell. In the evenings, the pool or tap room would be constantly heaving with drunks, many of whom worked all day and propped up the bar all night. Foreigners were occasionally seen in there and accepted by the local labour force. However, the weirdos knew their place was strictly in the lounge with the old ladies. I say old ladies because the 2 most prominent characters to take up residency in that room and remain there until the day they died were Betty and Laura, a pair of tiny little ancients, one blonde and one ebony black with white roots. They were always arguing, and often they would physically fight. Sat in the same seats every night of every week, they were an incredible comedy duo, and you only dared to sit in their seat if you really fancied a good slanging match to ease the boredom. Despite their mood swings and disputes, they were never apart, and I don't know who went first to the next life, but I doubt the other was long behind. Then there was Alan, another ancient Minnie, with Marty Feldman-style wonky glass eyes, which were fixed, looking in opposite directions. He was a moody old fucker who swore at everyone, not unlike the old girls. In fact, there was an awful lot of swearing went on in that pub, hence my choice of words throughout this paragraph. But despite his grumpiness towards me, I never ceased trying to befriend him or cheer him up. It was entirely his own choice that he remained insolent and cold, but consequently it meant that he was very amusing to be around and even more fun to wind up. One evening, sitting in the lounge with a friend waiting for others to arrive, I sculpted a perfect little Alan out of plasticine and used the matchstick to mimic his wooden leg. I never knew how he'd lost that leg. Nobody dare ask, not even me. He would walk quite well with it, stepping forward with the good one and dragging the other one along behind him to catch up before taking another step. I was impressed with the figurine myself, as it was a fluke I had thrown up in half an hour, which had very intricate detail and was also the absolute double of Alan. Proud of my efforts, I stood it up on the table for all to see, with it leaning back slightly on the false leg, just the way Alan did when he stood still. Ed and some others had joined us shortly afterwards, and all agreed it was a striking likeness to the miserable old cunt. It inspired much jollity. However, when Alan and his wooden legs slid over to collect our glasses, and his attention was drawn to the lifelike effigy, he swiftly knocked it off the table, clipped me around the back of the head, and told me to fuck off. I was mostly offended because he'd ruined my creation, but I did feel a bit bad that I'd upset him, not that he needed upsetting. Later, I got hold of a photo of him that Father the Fourth had taken, in which he was actually smiling, and I copied it to create a clay version of his head on a shield, similar to that which you will see a hunted animal's head on. I still have it to this day, but being a rare captured moment because Alan never smiled, although it was identical to the photograph, it never looked quite right. I think Alan liked Father the Fourth because he spent more time in the pub than he did at home, and was very generous with tips, unlike us young hooligans. The bunch of dope smokers who'd recently descended on Crumpsell had heard about the Edge as the place to be, and had ventured down there one evening to openly smoke pot and play tunes from the interesting selection on the jukebox. Unbeknownst to them, pansy boys and freaks were welcome, but only in the one room, and on their first visit they had flounced into the tap room, long hair, flowered shirts and all, to the extreme horror of the residents' shrewdness of apes. The remark that had sparked the mayhem was weirdo, but these kids weren't like the Crumpsell weirdos, who in their fear had learned to avoid the idiots, keep themselves in their place and away from trouble. Strange as they may have been, those council estate weirdos were well used to standing up to dickheads, and it had all kicked off. It was a violent story with a humorous ending thanks to the main man. A straight ape of the pool room had just attended a wedding in a posh white suit, and he'd triggered much animosity before ending up in a muddy puddle outside the pub. There was one black eye from that incident on show at the party where we met the new guys in town, but at least a dozen entertaining interpretations of their debut appearance at the Edgerton Inn. Vicky and Med's house was on the hill that leads down from Crumpsell village to the hospital, just a few doors down from St. Matthew's Church. It's a delightful old building that frequently boasted fly agaric mushrooms, easily accessible through the railings of its grounds. It's an unusually low-rise church built in quite an awkward spot between the forks of two roads, but with an especially mystical, oldie-worldy air about it. It was and still is the perfect setting for a fairies' playground. I don't recall who invited us to that party, but it was an instant hit-off for us all. We found ourselves mixing with many of the same essence, albeit from slightly different backgrounds. The theme running through us all was that of disappointment with the rest of society, and the want and need to explore other realms to escape the lie. Music was the main instigator of the search, and we suddenly found ourselves amongst an extended family with which we could share hopes, dreams, illusions, and even fears. There were musicians and artists galore, sharing houses open all hours, where you would always find some stone kid meddling with a guitar or creating a work of visionary genius. Vicky and Meds had a baby which at the time to me seemed so grown up and getting on with it, but as it turned out, he helped me grow up too. I spent quite a lot of time with that baby as he grew up through his toddling years. A sunny little Leo with an infectious laugh, he shared my adoration and understanding of animals and was an absolute joy and pleasure to be around. That boy grew up in the midst of bands and musical equipment in recording studios and rehearsal rooms, and encouraged by his mother and father, began playing drums at the age of 10. At present, he plays in a band called Citizen, and they are doing impressively well, considering the current music industry climate. His mother, Vicky, and I seemed to have a lot in common. She loved animals and children, music and magic, and on our first meeting, we realised we both had part of the Killing Joke Empire Song single cover in the same place on the same arm, tattooed. She has the big guy from the picture who looks like Geordie, wearing a jester outfit, and I have the little jester skull-like head thing on a stick, which the big guy is holding and looking at. That may not seem unusual to anyone else. However, to us it was a bit like finding a piece of our jigsaw, and since that meeting 25 years ago, we have shared a lot of our history. We both worked for Manchester University on archaeological digs too, except Vicky was building roundhouses whilst I was in the field scraping away at clay looking for Roman ruins. I loved that job. It gave me plenty of time and opportunity to chat with animals, being that most of the digs were on farmland. In the autumn I'd pick mushrooms, which helped me communicate a little better with the sheep. Though it wasn't a regular occurrence for me to eat mushrooms at work, it did help me see objects in the ground a lot easier. I always had a keen eye for detail and observed and recorded everything that went on and thought about it all deeply. But the extra sight I gained from mind-expansive helpers opened me up to see between planes as well as lines. I learned how remarkably clever and lovable pigs are when I befriended a young black pot-bellied chap who lived in a barn with an equally clever white duck. I'd pop in for a chat with them every day on the way to and from the dig and make time to scratch the pig's rough, hairy head. But I felt so sorry for him because he cried every time I left. At the initial party and meeting of minds, I chatted with a couple of guys who told me they were in the process of getting a band together. They had a couple of tracks, but they needed a keyboard player and maybe another singer to complete the lineup. I told them that I was looking for a way to start making music again, but that my best instrument was the Descamp recorder. I could play any tune I heard on that, or on the keyboard, a little flute, a little saxophone, and although I wasn't a great singer, I was far from tone deaf and had many of my own words written down. They said a collaboration sounded feasible, as they were amateurs themselves, and we arranged to meet up for a jam sometime soon after. There was no real starting point for Head Ritual. We just happened shortly after that meeting and evolved in a dark, damp cellar with incense to mask the smell of the mould, and excessive echo to cover the fact that we were a bit shit. Chorus and reverb added great effect to the poetry we threw out. The other members were interested in all things magical, especially the singer-guitarist, who had read most holy and not so holy books inside out. He was passionately interested in paganism and the occult, and appreciated some of my automatic writings. We became entangled with darkness and demon, goddess and god. But it was the dark side that Head Rituals seemed to evoke more than anything, and effortlessly at that. Each rehearsal was akin to some kind of evocation ceremony, which would build up slowly and steadily to a highly charged orgasmic peak in which we would all be lost on a mystical experience. Head Ritual by name, Head Ritual by nature, and it wasn't long before I was to learn the painful lessons about the supreme power of words. Killing Joke didn't tour in 1987, and it seemed there was some kind of discord going on within the band. However, they did release some remixes and also produced the album Outside the Gate. It is for sure an unusual offering which sounds much like a film score, but nevertheless is filled with great passion and thus is as powerful as any of their other releases. It boasts experimental sound effects and would make a superb soundtrack to any good film. I love it. It's an album that kept me company for many years to follow and would eventually help me survive some of the darkest hours of my life. Who could not be inspired by Jaz Coleman's words, "From what is in my ears, an enormous track"? The Calling by Jaz Coleman and Killing Joke. I hear the calling, carry across the landscape. I hear it echo from every city to every village upon the earth, from every rooftop to every mountain, calling the faithful to find themselves. A fire burning like precious water, the fire that drives me on and on. Through hell, I shall reach heaven. I shall not resist the changes before me. View the madness with perspective. The clock is ticking, but time means nothing. So I ascend to the blinding light, then plummet to the thickest darkness. And I always tell myself, how splendid is the adventure. I can no longer see good or evil, but worship polarity. So do not trust the beggars that expose their poverty of spirit, bleating, I will follow. I heed the calling. Follow yourselves as leaders. Arise, arise, stand upright and take pride in who and what you are. Great changes are coming and you will be asked to identify yourself. So run like a lion with inexhaustible strength from world to world. Let your work shine until the ends of time. Yeah, until the ends of time. Prindle's perception of this album is very different from mine and incredibly entertaining. Outside the Gates. Stupid album. Apparently it was supposed to be a jazz solo record, but the record company insisted that it be released under the Killing Joke name. A lawsuit ensued, but the main point here is that this album, aside from one really good song, doesn't sound like Killing Joke at all. Or rather, it sounds kind of like they said, hey, let's go back and make that angry music we used to make, then quickly followed up with the statement, and let's not use any guitars. What this record sounds like is a piece of shit 80s synth band trying to create bitter political music with no other components than dumbass, scary electronic noises and a singer who over-dramatizes every single syllable that comes out of his mouth. The melodies are terrible, and the presentation is unforgivable, not to mention hilariously dated. Obsession is a great upbeat, moody song that could have been on Brighter Than, but nothing else on here even comes close to doing this fine band justice. The excruciatingly boring and endless title track may in fact be the worst song they've ever written. So don't buy it, okay? Both Paul Walker and Paul Ferguson left the band during the sessions, leaving the drumming to session musician Jimmy Copley. And so should you. Also, just so you don't think I'm deaf, there are actually guitars on this album, but they're not really doing anything. The synths are in charge. I was riled up with aggressive energy. But with the absence of Killing Joke gigs, the only outlet time I had was on the stage with Head Ritual. The band soaked up most of my time during the late 80s, and we enjoyed gigging anywhere grunge alternatives were accepted. Our sound was quite unique, though unavoidably somewhat influenced by Killing Joke, with two of the band being fans. We were all in a state of mind that allowed our souls to speak through the music. But the openness seemed to promote cracks in the lining. Discord between the members of our own band meant we lost a drummer. Dunner played a lightly jazzy style, with tribal undertones. But we gained another, a fanatic Killing Joke fan, who had learned the drums from playing along with Big Paul. So then there were 3 of us in the band who had spent a substantial amount of our teenage years listening to and getting worked up about Killing Joke. I won't say the energy became stronger, as there was always a massive amount of magic in the air when Head Ritual played. But this was different, steadier, and felt more sustainable in general. I continued to write in an even more fluent way, just simple poetry about the feelings in my heart and the truth that I was seeking to understand fully. When I wasn't working with the band, I lived by night, creating sculptures or playing with magic, going on astral adventures and brushing shoulders with dark entities. In one particularly horrifying episode, which involved the skull of a prehistoric monkey, a Semnopithecus antilicus, which had found its way to me after being lifted from a history museum a few years earlier. Being a monkey myself, in the Chinese horoscope, I'd wanted to care for it, believing that I could heal the pain it might have endured before death by involving it in lovingly healing rituals. I felt it still held the energy of the living creature it once was, and I wore it round my neck during live shows. My favourite film at that time was Altered States, starring William Hurt as a scientist experimenting with sensory deprivation tanks whilst high on some kind of peyote mushroom, in which he reverts back to his ancestry ape-like way of being. He breaks out of the tank, goes wild in a zoo, and kills an antelope and eats it. One night during deep meditation, I decided to include the monkey skull and invited it to take me back to its time of being and show me how it had died. In less than 5 minutes, I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to move, as the skull had become hot and burned my hands. A searing pain shot up both my arms, and I heard an incessant ringing in my ears. It was agony, and so terrifying that all I wanted to do was run away, but I remained fixed to the spot and I couldn't escape. With strength summoned from fear and adrenaline, I managed to stand, get away from the altar and out of the room. That top floor attic room at Westbury Road contained some really immense energy. It is said that it was built directly on the ley lines that passed through the village, and many things had happened there that just could not be explained. Getting out of that room was all I could do to free myself from this horrendous experience. I stumbled out onto the landing and managed to prise the skull out of my hands, quickly wrapped it up in paper and stuffed it inside a shoebox. I packed that away into another larger box. I didn't touch it again for a long time. I was too frightened of what I'd accessed during that seeking meditation, which taught me a greater amount of respect within my dabbling. Years later, and only after many more house moves, I dared to open the box and take Mr. Semnopithecus back out again. There was no pain in my arms when I touched it, and I sort of tried to pass my apologies for delving into something I knew nothing about, and promptly removed the cheese wax and the snake-twisted sword and skull with which I had adorned it, and took it back to the museum where it belonged. And there's a photograph in the book here of myself, Maria, and Mr. Semnopithecus antilicus around my neck. We'd been members of a small Killing Joke fan club called Odic, but it had disappeared and now become Rubicon. The Rubicon is a shallow river, almost 80 kilometres long, running from the Apennine Mountains to the Adriatic Sea in northeast Italy. The Latin word rubico is derived from the adjective rubeus, meaning red. The River Rubicon's waters are coloured red by the mud deposits, and the river was key to protecting Rome from civil war. The idiom crossing the Rubicon means to pass a point of no return, and this sat well with me. The opening lines of the first poem I'd put to music with head ritual being, "Can't stop now because we've gone too far." To cross the Rubicon makes reference to Julius Caesar's army crossing the river in 49 BC, which was considered an act of insurrection or rebellion. Ed and I were keen to remain members of any Killing Joke Club, as it ensured we received notification of secret gigs and gatherings, as well as limited record releases and so forth. The main event of 1988 was a Killing Joke party at the Porchester Hall in London in December. It was to be an enactment of a medieval party, and it required some members to help out with preparations, as well as some to dress up for the occasion and serve drinks, which consisted mainly of red wine or mead. I was jubilant at the opportunity to be part of the occasion and swiftly offered my services to play the part of a wench behind the bar to serve up the alcohol. We took the coach down to London, Ed, Ant, and I, with the ever-interested Pikey, showing his enthusiasm outwardly by turning up at the bus station with a bag full of books on magic. He was dressed in a black jacket, skin-tight black jeans, and as usual his hair was perfectly spiked. We all had so much to chat about on the journey down there, mostly about what we were doing at work or college, and I shared a horror story about a trip I'd made to France earlier that year, with some of the head ritual guys, Vicky and her son, who was just 2 years old at the time. We managed to escape on the cheap by jumping trains, spending what we saved on whiskey, and as a result it turned out to be one of the most mishap-filled trips of my life. We were collared by inspectors on one train, and I had tried to amend the situation by speaking in French and using my acting skills to appeal to his compassionate side. However, I was useless at French, and while I thought I was telling the ticket collector my father will be incensed, please let us off, I had actually been saying my father is shit and so are you. The confused inspector was very patient considering, and simply wrote us out some fine tickets and chucked us off the train. After that we wound up in Bordeaux in the dark of the night, and on my stupid recommendation pitched our tents on the equivalent of what would be Albert Square in Manchester. We hadn't realised it was the local red light district either, and the resident transvestite street ladies had not taken kindly to the intrusion. They were incensed at the idea that we had taken their patch. Foolishly drunk, and not at all keen on the accusation that we were prostitutes, I had thrown a dig at the biggest of the bunch, who until that moment I had thought was female. The 6-foot guy had hit me back hard, and so we decided to run. But he and his 3 associates made chase, whilst rooting through their handbags, dropping their makeup and perfume on the ground before brandishing Stanley knives. The sight of the blade stopped me in my tracks, and I turned to face my aggressors, because I was just not a fast runner and I didn't fancy getting stabbed in the back. In an attempt to protect myself in the continuing scuffle, I accidentally ripped the shirt off the guy who had given me the right hook, which revealed his plastic breastplate with 2 large boobs and no nipples. In the shock of his exposure, he fumbled around in an attempt to cover up, during which time we managed to escape them and get back to the tent. Just when we thought it was all over, as I was laughing in disbelief and checking the huge lump on my forehead, we noticed there were people coming towards us from all around. We then found ourselves surrounded by a circle of irate prostitutes of varying size and sex. They were all pointing weapons our way as they moved in on us like a herd of cattle. As a short, stocky female approached me with what I thought was a gun, I opened my mouth to try and plead our innocence and got a massive spray of CS gas down my throat. Vicky took a good beating from a baseball bat, whilst I clambered into the tent to get the baby in the hope that the attackers would see we were not there to make trouble, and also that they wouldn't start bashing at the tent. However, in doing so, I ignorantly put CS gas all over Jord, but the sight of the baby did calm the mad cows down, and they eventually ceased the attack. The HR guys had disappeared while we took the brunt of the warfare, but they came back in good time with the French police. Sadly for us, it seemed that the gendarmes were tightly connected to the prozzies. They were very fishy goings-on indeed, and so there was no assistance from them, other than a ride to a hostel, where we were ordered to clean ourselves up and stay for the night. It seems to me almost anything can be obtained by sex in our society, and I long for the day when truth and integrity reign. So many other over-the-top incidents occurred on that trip, things you just couldn't make up, and that included our witnessing a guy picked up from the sea by a helicopter with a leg missing. We did speculate it was a shark attack, but being very slow in the French language department, we never found out what actually happened to him. As was our creating of bad luck at that time, we decided to stay out of the water just in case. I put it all down to the mad energy that was being collectively aroused by the head ritual crew. The trip was just total chaos from beginning to end. Although we did find a nice beach in the southwest, where we camped amidst the tall trees of the woods for a while. I've only been to France once since that event, and that was to dance for a group of guys who were imitating the band Scooter. I'd been dragged into that by a German producer called Christoph, who'd been attempting to help me with a solo creation at Abraham Moss Studios later on in the 90s. As usual, it ended in tears when I discovered he, like the other producers I've met over the years, was not really interested in helping me with my music unless I wanted to help him with an extramarital affair. I rest my case. Arriving in London early to help with preparations, we had time for a look around town. It was a crisp and sunny morning, and hungry after the 6-hour coach trip, we traipsed through several hotels and pinched a few bread rolls and butter to keep us going. The Porchester Hall is an interesting building with several different floors, and there's a library on one of them. Once we were inside, Ed and I took a short nap on the tables, whilst we waited for Mr. Coleman to appear with the schedule for the day. He arrived dressed smartly in a black suit and carrying a black briefcase, with a brighter than 1,000 suns sticker clearly on show. I was smoking a joint inside at that time, which seems crazy now, and Jazz immediately put his hand out to take it from me. I passed the spliff to him, but I was shocked and nervous in his presence. I didn't know what to do, so I immediately asked for it back. I must have appeared as a desperate pothead who couldn't go for a second without a joint in my mouth. I suppose I wasn't that far off that, but it was that whenever I got near Mr. Coleman, nerves went haywire and I turned into a total cabbage. Jazz gave out the commands, and Ed and I began to bring equipment and supplies up in the lift to the room where the party was being held. Ed worked so hard moving tables around and humping boxes, and I laid a lot of the food out as well as preparing the wine in a huge barrel behind the bar. Not all of the expected helpers had turned up, so he played a big part in getting the show on the road, especially Ed. We did have a laugh in the lift with one of the road crew because we had to go up and down so many times. He was a French guy, actually, called Philly, who I'm now told works for the Orb. It was a long day and we were tired from the coach trip, as well as half pissed from sampling the wine and stoned. Jazz had treated us to his passionate piano playing whilst we set up the tables. I was so impressed I could hardly keep my eyes off him. There'd been a piano in the first housing co-op I lived in, and I'd taken to it quite well, but never mastered it. And I'd been really jealous of two of my friends from non-broken homes, who were blessed by parents who had forced them to take piano lessons, and they both played really well. After his pianist delights, Jazz was gone for most of the preparations, but popped in now and then to oversee what was going on. At one point, he came back to inspect as we were laying the last food out on the tables, and he gave a few last-minute instructions. It did look spectacular, and he aired his appreciation, but mainly about his own choice of food. My silly side was coming out as always, and I was half gone, and I had the urge to make some fun. Ed was straightening things out, laying on his last touches of perfection, and so I seized the moment. Giggling to myself, I shouted to Jazz whilst pointing at Ed, "Hey, look, he's pinching the food." It was just a joke, and I was laughing when I said it, but Jazz spun round to look at Ed and went berserk. His eyes bulged ferociously as he stared at Ed, pointed at the door and yelled, "Get out! Get out!" I quickly explained to Jazz that I was joking, but I don't think he heard me because he said no more and walked away. He neither laughed nor showed any sign of amusement, but mind you, neither did Ed, who had gone beetroot with embarrassment. Pikey and I were rolling around in fits of laughter, but I knew I was in Ed's bad books, and probably Jazz's too. It was soon forgotten when I got Ed a drink, and we had a laugh about the possible consequences. If Jazz had insisted Ed left, it would have been terrible, seeing that he had done so much work and he hadn't touched the food at all. Whilst filling a barrel with red wine shortly after the silliness, I overheard someone say that the jester had failed to show. The suit had arrived, but there was no one to wear it. I'd already tried the on-the-wench dress, and it looked great, but the thought of being a jester was so much more appealing to me. I quickly offered myself as a stand-in, and without further ado, I was skipping around in a red and green suit, jingling 3 bells on my head and shaking a little magic stick. Now that was me. I felt right at home and spent the rest of the night shaking my bells and encouraging as much merriment as was possible by inciting dancing and laughter, as well as pinching the odd bum. At one point, I was standing looking at the stage, and Jazz came up behind me, placed a hand around my waist and asked if I was having a good time. I was so embarrassed, I just couldn't cope with him being near me, so I told him yes and then quickly ran off, frantically shaking the stick with the bell. When Killing Joke appeared on the stage that night, it really was sheer ecstasy for us all. The mix could have been terrible, but we were so out of it we wouldn't have noticed. Their opening song was The Pandies Are Coming, the lyrics of which are dissected in Jazz Coleman's Icelandic Adventure, An Irrational Domain Part 1. Ed was so drunk and excited by the opening song that he promptly fell over. He was soon back up on his feet and dancing on tables and all over the place, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Beautiful!" And it was just that. I had never seen Ed dance before, so it was a very special moment. The whole experience for KJ addicts was just phenomenal, as all those in attendance would surely agree. They performed Extremities, which they hadn't released at that time, and I guess Jazz hadn't made up his mind about the first chorus because he sang words not recorded on the album. They were supported that night by Voices of Morocco, a deeply stirring combination of sound and dance. We drank, we smoked, we wrote and we rehearsed, and we drank some more and we smoked some more, and we wrote and we rehearsed, and we drank while we rehearsed. The drinking was excessive, and brawling became part and parcel of the drunken moments. In particular, the bass player from Head Ritual enjoyed being thrown around by a woman. So our party piece became just that. Me throwing him around the room whilst wildly intoxicated, using various wrestling or judo moves or anything I made up which looked effective, and caused as little damage as possible to his small frame. I had learned quite a lot over the years, attending grappling lessons and various martial arts classes, and these all came in handy for the show. I had great dreams for Head Ritual, enough ambition to take us all the way, but the rest of the band seemed happy with drunkenness and playing and wanted nothing from our efforts. I envisaged, during a live show with a decent crowd in attendance, that I would at some point dive on the bass player, make it look serious, throw him into the audience and grapple him till he tapped out. It was a fantastic idea, and Jet was well up for it, but we would have had to practice properly and remain sober for it to work any time without excessive chance of injury. Later on, I learned about the Clown Posse, a band of musical wrestlers who'd been fighting on stage for years. They had 2 full-size wrestling rings at the front of the stage in which they performed throughout the show. It's a brilliant idea. We had so much fun in those years and invoked much mayhem. But chaos magic is what it was all about. And we encased that in our shared motto for the band. No reason. E-I-E-I-O.